maintain the consistency of the characters. This is a story about black bosses in the early 1930 segundos, 19, specifically Bumpy Johnson, August 14, 1948. The agreement that Frank Costello and Ellsworth Johnson had negotiated in February 1946 was, by most measures, working exactly as intended. For 2.5 years, Harlem's numbers and policy operations had continued to generate substantial profits for both Negro operators and the Italian crime families. The percentage of revenue flowing from Harlem to Costello's organization remained steady, payments were made on time, and the operational independence that Johnson had fought so hard to secure remained intact. But as is often the case with arrangements between powerful men operating outside the law, the success of the agreement at the leadership level did not always translate to perfect understanding at the street level. The bosses knew the terms. The bosses respected the boundaries. But the soldiers, the young enforcers and collectors in muscle who did the day-to-day work of organized crime, did not always receive or understand the nuances of deals negotiated in private dining rooms between men they might never meet. This disconnect between leadership and soldiers, between strategy and execution, had created occasional friction over the past 2 years. A Harlem numbers runner would be roughed up by Italian enforcers who did not understand that he was protected. A Negro collector would be accused of operating in Italian territory when he was actually servicing customers who lived on the Harlem side of an ambiguous boundary. These incidents were typically resolved quickly once the facts were reported up the chain of command. Once Bumpy or one of his lieutenants contacted Costello, or one of his people once the misunderstanding was clarified, and the offending soldiers were disciplined for overstepping their authority. But each incident carried risk. Each confrontation between Negro operators and Italian enforcers who did not understand the 1946 agreement created the possibility that violence would erupt before cooler heads could intervene, that someone would be killed over a misunderstanding, and that such a killing might spiral into the kind of war that both Bumpy and Costello had worked so carefully to prevent. By August 1948, the most common source of these misunderstandings involved the heroin trade, which was rapidly becoming the most lucrative criminal enterprise in New York City. The Italian families, particularly the Luciano organization now controlled by Costello, had established connections to heroin suppliers in Italy and Turkey and were flooding the city with product. Distribution of this heroin required street-level dealers and injection houses where addicts could purchase and use the drug. In Harlem, many of these dealers and houses were operated by Negro criminals who paid tribute to Bumpy Johnson, who in turn paid his agreed-upon percentage to Costello's organization. This arrangement mirrored the structure that had governed the numbers racket since 1935. But heroin was different from gambling. Heroin created desperation, attracted a more dangerous class of criminal, and generated conflicts the gambling operations rarely produced. The boundaries that seemed clear when discussing policy slips and numbers runners became blurred when discussing heroin corners and shooting galleries. Bumpy Johnson, for his part, had mixed feelings about the heroin trade. He understood its profitability. He understood that refusing to participate would simply mean that other criminals would control it, and that Harlem's addicts would suffer regardless of his involvement or abstention. But he also saw what heroin was doing to his community. He saw young men and women who might have become something better reduced to desperate addicts willing to steal from their own families for another dose. He saw the social fabric of Harlem beginning to tear under the weight of addiction. And he knew, though he rarely spoke about it publicly, that his participation in this trade, however indirect, made him complicit in that destruction. Still, he rationalized his involvement by telling himself that he at least ensured the business was conducted with some degree of order, that dealers who worked under his protection were required to follow certain rules, that the worst excesses of the trade were curtailed by his oversight. On the evening of August 14, 1948, Bumpy was conducting an inspection of several heroin operations on the western edge of Harlem, an area that bordered the Italian neighborhood of East Harlem across 116th Street. These inspections were part of his regular routine. He would visit dealers, ensure they were paying their percentages correctly, verify that they were not cutting the product so heavily that customers were complaining or dying, and remind them that violence was bad for business and would not be tolerated. He traveled with only one associate that evening, a young enforcer named William Graves, who served as both driver and bodyguard. The decision to travel with minimal security was calculated. Bumpy believed that showing excessive caution or bringing large numbers of armed men would signal weakness or distrust. He preferred to project confidence, to move through Harlem as if he owned it, which in many ways he did. At approximately 9:30 p.m., Bumpy and Graves visited a dealer named Marcus Washington who operated out of a third-floor apartment on 116th Street, about 2 blocks west of Pleasant Avenue, the main artery of Italian East Harlem. The visit was routine. Washington reported his weekly numbers, delivered his payment, and assured Bumpy that business was steady with no complications. Bumpy and Graves departed at 9:55 p.m. and began walking back toward their car, which was parked on the corner of 116th and 2nd Avenue. They had walked perhaps 50 yards when 4 men emerged from a doorway and blocked their path. All 4 were white, probably Italian based on their appearance, and all 4 were young, likely in their 20s, and all 4, Bumpy noticed immediately, had pistols either in their hands or visibly tucked into their waistbands. The leader of the group, a stocky man with slicked-back hair in a badly fitting suit, spoke first. His tone was aggressive, accusatory. "You're a long way from home. This is Pleasant Avenue territory. You've got no business here." Bumpy remained perfectly still, his face showing no emotion, his hands visible and empty. He had been in situations like this before, had faced armed men who wanted to prove something or stake a claim or simply demonstrate that they were not afraid of the legendary Bumpy Johnson. He understood the dynamics. These were young soldiers trying to make a name, trying to show their bosses that they were tough and vigilant. They probably did not know who he was, beyond the general knowledge that a well-dressed Negro man in this neighborhood was likely a criminal of some kind. They certainly did not know about the 1946 agreement or understand that the boundary they believed he had crossed was not, actually, a boundary that applied to him. Bumpy's associate, William Graves, began to reach toward his own weapon, but Bumpy stopped him with a slight gesture. Violence would solve nothing here. If Graves pulled his gun, the 4 Italian soldiers would almost certainly fire, and while Graves might take 1 or 2 of them with him, Bumpy would likely die in the crossfire, even if they somehow managed to kill all 4 soldiers. The deaths of Italian enforcers at the hands of Bumpy Johnson and his associate would shatter the 1946 agreement and trigger exactly the kind of war that Bumpy had spent years trying to prevent. No, violence was not the answer. Intelligence was the answer. Words were the answer, and more specifically, the right words, delivered with the right tone, would either save his life or get him killed within the next 60 seconds. The stocky Italian soldier raised his pistol and pointed it directly at Bumpy's chest. "I asked you a question. What are you doing in our territory?" 2 of the other soldiers also drew their weapons, though they held them at their sides rather than aiming them. The 4th man, slightly older than the others, and standing toward the back of the group, looked uncertain, as if he was beginning to sense that this confrontation might not be as straightforward as it had initially seemed. Bumpy recognized that uncertainty and understood that his best chance of surviving the next minute was to speak to that uncertainty, to plant a seed of doubt that would make these soldiers hesitate long enough to verify their assumptions before pulling triggers they could not unpull. Bumpy spoke calmly, his voice steady and clear. Loud enough for all 4 men to hear, but not loud enough to sound like he was shouting or panicking. "I'm here on business that your boss approved. If you don't believe me, if you think I'm lying or if you think I'm somewhere I shouldn't be, then you should do exactly one thing before you make any decisions you can't undo." The stocky soldier with the pistol aimed at Bumpy's chest narrowed his eyes. "What thing?" Bumpy let the silence hang for just a moment, long enough to ensure that all 4 men were listening, that they understood the weight of what he was about to say. Then he delivered 3 words, spoken with absolute confidence, an absolute calm. "Ask your boss." The words hung in the air between them. The stocky soldier's pistol remained pointed at Bumpy's chest, his finger on the trigger, his face showing confusion and the beginning of something that might have been doubt. "Ask our boss what?" "Ask him if Bumpy Johnson is allowed to conduct business on 116th Street. Ask him if there's an arrangement you don't know about. Ask him if killing me would make him happy or get ya. Killed yourselves." The older soldier in the back, the one who had looked uncertain from the beginning, spoke for the first time. "You're Bumpy Johnson?" Bumpy nodded slowly. "I am, and if you know that name, then you know I don't need to sneak into Italian territory. I don't need to hide what I'm doing. And I definitely do need to explain myself to 4 soldiers who do know enough about their own organization's business to recognize when they about to make a mistake that could cost them their lives. The stocky soldier, the one with the gun, still pointed at Bumpy's chest, looked back at the older man. You know this guy? The older man nodded slowly, his face now showing clear concern. I know the name. He's the Harlem boss. He's got some kind of deal with Costello, has for years. I don't know the details, but I know enough to know we shouldn't be pointing guns at him without checking first. The stocky soldier's hand wavered slightly, the pistol dipping a few inches before he raised it again, trying to maintain his show of strength, even as doubt began to erode his certainty. How do I know you're not lying? How do I know you're really Bumpy Johnson, and not just some numbers runner using his name? Bumpy's response was instant and cold. Call your boss and find out. Because if I am lying, he'll tell you to shoot me, and this will be over. But if I'm not lying, if I really am who I say I am, then every second you keep that gun pointed at me is another second you're disrespecting a man who has Frank Costello as personal protection. You think that through. You think about what happens to soldiers who disrespect men that Frank Costello protects. The older soldier stepped forward, reaching into his pocket. I'm calling in. We're not doing anything until we know for sure. He pulled out a small notebook with phone numbers written inside, found the one he wanted, and walked to a nearby payphone on the corner. The other 3 soldiers remained where they were, guns still drawn, surrounding Bumpy and Graves. But the energy had shifted. The immediate threat of violence had been replaced by tense waiting, by the understanding that whatever happened next would depend on what the voice on the other end of that phone call said. Bumpy remained motionless, his hands still visible, his face still calm. He had done what he could. He had planted the doubt, invoked the magic words that might save his life. Now he could only wait and hope that whoever answered that phone call understood the situation and had the authority or knowledge to confirm what Bumpy had said. The older soldier spoke into the payphone, his voice too quiet for Bumpy to hear the specific words, but his tone clearly urgent. The conversation lasted perhaps 90 seconds. Then the older soldier hung up and walked back to the group. His face pale, his expression now clearly anxious. He addressed the stocky soldier who still held his pistol aimed at Bumpy. Put the gun away. Right now. The stocky soldier looked confused. What? Why? Because the guy I just talked to told me that Bumpy Johnson has been operating in this area under a direct arrangement with Mr. Costello since 1946. He told me that nobody, and I mean nobody, is supposed to interfere with Johnson's operations anywhere in Harlem or the border areas. He told me that if we had actually shot this man, Mr. Costello would have personally ordered us killed for violating an agreement he spent years negotiating. So I'm telling you again, put your fucking gun away before you get us all murdered. The stocky soldier lowered his pistol slowly, his hand shaking slightly, his face now showing the recognition of how close he had come to making a fatal error. The other 2 soldiers also lowered their weapons, stepping back to create more space between themselves and Bumpy. The older soldier addressed Bumpy directly, his voice apologetic and respectful. Mr. Johnson, I apologize. We didn't know. We're new to this territory and nobody told us about the arrangement. We saw a Negro man in what we thought was our area, and we assumed we made a mistake. We're sorry. Bumpy looked at each of the 4 men in turn, his gaze steady and cold. Tennis spoke his words chosen carefully to send a message that extended beyond this specific moment. You made 2 mistakes tonight. First mistake was thinking you knew more than you actually knew. Second mistake was pointing guns before asking questions. In my business, in your business, those kinds of mistakes get people killed. You're alive right now because I chose words instead of bullets. Remember that. Remember that intelligence beats firepower. Remember that checking with your boss before you act isn't weakness. It's smart business. And remember that the next time you see me or any of my people in this neighborhood or anywhere else, you keep your hands away from your weapons and your mouths shut unless you have something intelligent to say. The 4 Italian soldiers nodded, murmured additional apologies, and then walked away quickly, clearly eager to remove themselves from a situation that could have ended with all of them dead by morning. Bumpy watched them go, then turned to William Graves. "We're leaving. But we're not running. We're walking to the car like nothing happened." Graves nodded, and the two men walked calmly to their vehicle, got in, and drove back into Harlem proper. Neither spoke during the drive. There was nothing that needed to be said. Both understood how close they had come to dying over a misunderstanding, and both understood that Bumpy's 3 words, "Ask your boss," had been the only thing standing between them and bullets. The following morning, August 15th, 1948, Bumpy received an unexpected visit at his home. Frank Costello himself, accompanied only by his driver, arrived at 10 a.m. and requested a private conversation. Bumpy invited him into his living room, offered coffee which Costello accepted, and waited for the prime minister of the mob to explain why he had come personally rather than sending an emissary. Costello spoke without preamble, his tone apologetic and genuinely concerned. "I heard about last night. I heard that 4 of my soldiers, 4 idiots who apparently don't listen when they're told things, pointed guns at you on 116th Street. I want you to know that this was not sanctioned, it was not intended, and it will not happen again. Those 4 men have been removed from that territory and reassigned to work where they could cause international incidents. The older one, the one who had sense enough to call before shooting, he's being promoted because he showed good judgment. The other 3 are being demoted and will spend the next 6 months doing the worst jobs I can find for them, so they learn to think before they act." Bumpy sipped his coffee and studied Costello's face. The man seemed genuinely upset, genuinely concerned that the incident might damage their arrangement. This told Bumpy something important. It told him that Costello valued their partnership, that the 1946 agreement was not just words on paper or a temporary convenience, but rather something that Costello considered important enough to personally ensure its continuation. "I appreciate you coming here yourself," Bumpy said. "You didn't have to do that. You could have sent someone." Costello shook his head. "When my people put guns in your face, when they threaten the life of a man I gave my word to protect, call me myself. That's what respect looks like. That's what our agreement means. Those kids last night, they didn't understand that. They thought every Negro in Italian territory was fair game. They learned different. The whole organization is learning different. I'm making sure everyone knows that Bumpy Johnson operates under my personal protection, that our 1946 arrangement stands, and that anyone who interferes with your business answers to me directly." The 2 men talked for another 30 minutes, discussing not just the previous night's incident, but the broader state of their partnership. Costello expressed concern about the heroin trade and its potential to create exactly the kind of misunderstandings that had nearly resulted in Bumpy's death. Bumpy acknowledged those concerns and proposed that they establish clearer guidelines about where heroin operations could be located and how disputes should be handled before they escalated to violence. They agreed to schedule a more formal meeting within the next month to address these issues. In detail, when Costello departed, he shook Bumpy's hand and repeated his apology one final time. "You handled last night perfectly. Those 3 words, ask your bust, that was exactly right. You could have started a war. Instead, you started a phone call. That's intelligence. That's leadership. That's why our arrangement works." The story of what happened on 116th Street on August 14, 1948, spread rapidly through both Harlem's Negro criminal community and the Italian crime families. The details varied depending on who was telling the story, but the essential facts remained constant. Bumpy Johnson had been confronted by armed Italian soldiers who did not know about his protected status. Instead of responding with violence, he had spoken 3 words that forced them to verify their assumptions before acting. Those 3 words, ask your boss, had saved his life and prevented a war. The story became a teaching moment, a parable about the importance of understanding the arrangements your organization has made before you enforce rules that might not actually exist. For Bumpy Johnson personally, the incident reinforced a lesson he had learned many times over his 25-year criminal career. Power was not just about being willing to use violence. Power was about knowing when violence was unnecessary, when words could accomplish what bullets could not, when invoking the right authority or the right relationship could turn a potentially fatal confrontation into a mere misunderstanding quickly resolved. The fact that 3 words could make 4 armed men lower their weapons and apologize demonstrated a kind of power that exceeded physical force. It demonstrated the power of reputation, of strategic relationships, of agreements carefully negotiated and seriously enforced. It demonstrated that Bumpy Johnson had achieved something rare in the criminal underworld. He had made himself not just feared, which any violent man could accomplish, but respected at the institutional level, protected not by his own guns, but by his value as a partner to men more powerful than himself. The 1946 agreement with Frank Costello would last another 3 years, until Bumpy's arrest and conviction on federal heroin charges in 1951. During those 3 years, there would be other misunderstandings, other moments when soldiers or low-level enforcers would fail to understand the arrangement and would need to be educated. But none of those incidents would come as close to violence as the confrontation on 116th Street in August 1948. The lesson had been learned. The message had been sent. Bumpy Johnson was not just another Negro gangster operating at the sufferance of the Italian families. He was a protected partner, a man whose business was sanctioned at the highest levels, a man whose name carried weight, not because of what he might do, but because of who stood behind him. And if you did not understand that, if you were foolish enough to point a gun at him without checking first, then 3 simple words would teach you what you should have already known. Ask your boss.